Occupied Poland during the Second World War was probably one of the worst places on earth to be. A descent into ever lower circles of hell. Here is one of the lowest, the Auschwitz-Birkenau camp. Beside me, the train tracks were laid down in May 1944 to receive 340,000 Hungarian Jews, most of whom were later murdered. Welcome to a special edition of How We Got Here with me, Jan Darasz. We'll be joined by a specialist historian and we'll be discussing the origins, the development and the dark legacy of this place.
Wheels are rushing on the rails, hurrying towards the victory of the crime, carrying people to the gas, people to the ovens, piles of people soaked in petrol. The fumes are thick, stinking fumes. Here, people are burning people.
I'm approaching the main entrance of the Auschwitz camp. It's a very forbidding place, and I've got a guide to guide us around the camp of Auschwitz and Birkenau. And who better to ask is one of our guests at How We Got Here, Alina Nowobilska. Hello.
Thank you so much for inviting me here today.
Alina, two short questions to you. Why Auschwitz? What was it for? And who was the first intake of prisoners?
Really simple. There were so many mass arrests happening in 1939 and 1940 after the invasion of Poland that these prisons are getting filled. You're looking at cells of a 2-man, 3-man cell with 20 people in it. The heads of these prisons are desperate to get rid of these prisoners, and the concentration camps in Germany are just overfilled. They have to create a new camp, and they decide on here. And
Poland was already conquered by then.
Well, exactly. And there's 3 reasons why they specifically chose here. If you look behind me, you can see there's already an existing infrastructure, and that was for the Polish cavalry. So you're cost-saving money, basically. Secondly, it's isolated between 2 rivers. So you've got the River Soła and the River Wisła. And third of all is the ability to move people by rail. There's an extensive railway network here. And your next question was to ask who came here. So yes. The first mass transport of prisoners was 728 Poles and a handful of Polish Jews. They arrived here 14th of June 1940, and the one thing I did want to underline here is that the Jewish prisoners, the Polish Jews that arrived here, were not arrested for being Jewish. They were arrested because they were part of the intelligentsia. They were being exterminated, part of the AB action. They were caught crossing the borders. They were part of the resistance.
So, Alina, take us through the camp.
From a pile of corpses, dead faces stare, without mouths, without noses, pupils of glass. They look at the stars. Rats dance in ruddy processions.
Okay, Alina, we're in a washroom in one of the blocks in Auschwitz I. Tell me about a day in the life of a prisoner.
Well, how did the day start is a question to what time of year we're talking about, because in the summer and obviously in the spring you'd get up earlier at 4:30, and then in the winter a little bit later at 5:30. Prisoners had to get up, they had to clean the barracks, they had to tidy up. They would come in here into the washroom or use the toilets, which would have been next door. The problem here though is that there's a lot of people in this one barrack, and not everybody has that 30 minutes to be able to use the toilet. So a lot of prisoners would miss out using it, even though they suffered with such horrific diseases. Like, for example, diarrhea was a horrible disease that would have taken over at this point. Prisoners would then have breakfast, say that in a very loose term, breakfast, because they would have half a litre of coffee substitute or kind of herbal tea. I mean, that's not enough to fill you or I up or anybody to go out to work. They stand for roll call then. Roll call, you'd like to think, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Sometimes these roll calls would last for hours. The longest roll call, for example, was literally a matter of weeks into the first transports arriving into Auschwitz. They stood for up to 20 hours just because one prisoner was missing. So roll call could take such a long time to be able to add up all these numbers. Prisoners would then go to work, and obviously the work varied. So you would have work on site, so maybe tidying the camp up, working in the kitchen, working for the camp orchestra, working in the camp hospital, or they could be things like going out to work where you would take part and work in factories and things like that, or the fields. That was another very popular sort of commander. And then, when obviously the day finished, these guys were out working for 11 hours in the summer, much longer. They had to bring in the dead that they'd lost in the meantime. And the one thing I didn't cover very briefly is they also have lunch for an hour. And for lunch they get half a litre of soup, and which is pretty much the same as they would get for dinner. And it is, I want to say it's good food that they received. Is low nutrition. The vegetables are low quality. And they'd also get 300 grams of bread on top of that, which was padded out with sawdust. And if they're lucky, 20 grams of sausage or a tablespoon of marmalade. But, you know, again, low quality food. This is about 1,200 kilocalories. It is not enough to sustain anyone.
Water, water, water. Give me water. My tongue is swelling, my chapped lips cracking. The golden-haired girl is dying. On a rotten barrow, let her die. Let her die.
We're in a rare interior in a rare building, and we've got a very rare view out of the window. We're in Rudolf Höss's villa. So he's the SS commandant of Auschwitz. Tell me about him.
I've got to tell you, it's a very surreal experience where we're standing right now. Höss was the first commandant of Auschwitz. He stayed for quite a while before being sent away. He does return actually in May of 1944 for the deportation and mass murder of the Hungarian Jews. He is the man who builds the ramp that we were standing at earlier today. He ends up being tried post-war. He writes a memoir.
But he also brings his family to this place.
He does actually bring his family.
So close to the camp.
His children. This is explained. I don't understand this personally, where you have children playing literally in an eye-line sight of a stone throws away from the crematorium. So they built the crematorium pretty early, so in August of 1940. So it had been functioning for a really long time, and these children are playing in these plumes of smoke of the bodies of dead prisoners, for God's sakes.
Out of about 6,000 Auschwitz staff, only 789 ever stood trial. The majority of the cases were pursued in Poland and the Federal Republic of Germany. Tried before Poland's Supreme National Tribunal in Warsaw, Camp Commandant Rudolf Höss was sentenced to death on April 2, 1947, and hanged in Auschwitz I on April 16 near Crematorium I. 40 former Auschwitz staff members were brought to trial, including Commandant Arthur Liebenhenschel, Auschwitz I Commandant Hans Aumeier, and women's camp leader Maria the Beast Mandel. A total of 23 death sentences were carried out. Although justice was served, the horrid evil could not be undone. Many Jews view the victims of the Holocaust as martyrs who died for their faith or identity, invoking the concept of Kiddush Hashem, meaning the sanctification of God's name.
And this is quite a remarkable and poignant picture gallery. Dead prisoners.
Yes.
And you mentioned before the photographer. So tell me a bit about him and what his work involved.
So Wilhelm Brasser was one of the many photographers of Auschwitz, and he took photographs beginning of 1941 to be able to give the SS an identification of the prisoners that were escaping, right? So the great thing about this is that nearly 40,000 of these photographs survive, and that is because of Wilhelm Brasser. And during the evacuation process, when they were destroying all the various different documents, what he did is he threw the negatives all into the furnace, piled one on top of each other, and because there was no air, it just couldn't burn. You can see many of these photographs, people have been beaten, and torture and beatings was normal. It was a very normal occurrence that happened in the camp. You have Block 11, which is at the end of the camp here, which is a prison within a prison. In its cells, you have things like standing cells where prisoners would have to stand for hours on end. And we're talking about overnight, after they've done 11, 12, 13 hours worth of labour. You have starvation cells where prisoners were literally starved to death. You have the wall of death where people were shot. Executions are a daily occurrence. You do not know if you're going to survive to the following day.
What about the medical experiments themselves?
We have a wide pool of victims available here. I mean, the doctors they were spoiled for choice for whatever they wanted to study. In Block 10 here, where we are in the main camp, where Karl Klauberg, for example, he operated on sterilisation, where he would inject various different forms of liquid into women's fallopian tubes. Or you had Horst Schumann, who also operated on both men and women to work on sterilisation methods, where he'd use X-rays to X-ray men's testicles and women's fallopian tubes. And of course, the most probably well-known person within the medical experiment community, which is Mengele, who operated on twins and various other different things. So, for example, the difference in irises, and also he was fascinated by dwarfism as well.
In a crowd spread out on the ground, a shoe hits the breast lying on the ground, stumbles on a human head. A shout rises, a shout of thousands flies into space.
One of the things that strikes you when you walk around the Birkenau camp is the sheer scale of the camp. And we're in these barracks, these dozens of barracks, and they're all segregated as to nationality, function, sex. Tell us about that. Where are we now? This is the children's area in the women's section.
It is. This is one of my favourite barracks, and that is because if we look here, you see all these beautiful paintings done for the children who arrived here from the Warsaw Uprising during and just after the Warsaw Uprising. But we don't know who the artist is at the end of the day. In total, you have about 232,000 children that arrive here. Over 200,000 of them are Jewish, and they go straight into the gas chamber. About 23,000 of them are Polish. They arrive from, like I said, Warsaw Uprising, Zamość, and other nationalities.
Zamość evacuations, the forcible evacuations.
Forced deportations, yeah, exactly. And they end up here in this barrack. But it's not just children, obviously, that arrive that are Polish children and Jewish children, but there are Jews that arrive from all around Europe, from Western Europe, from Southern Europe, even from Norway. You have Jews arriving from there as well. You have Jews coming even from Greece, and we can imagine how long that journey took. It's absolutely incredible. The other thing we also have a Roma and Sinti camp as well. That was known as the family camp. You have 23,000 of them deported here to Auschwitz. They all get gassed at about just as the Warsaw Uprising begins on the 2nd of August of 44. Then you have a propaganda section, and that is for the Theresienstadt ghetto Jews as well, who arrive because the Red Cross was supposed to come here and they were supposed to inspect the camp. That's where you have all the photographs and things like that of how everybody's happy and the families are all together. Then you have Poles, you have Soviet prisoners of war, you have people from Belarus, you have Ukrainians. I mean, it is so multinational here.
So at its peak, if we can reiterate, there are 1.3 million human beings.
In total, there were 1.3 million people that ended up here, and out of the 1.3 million, I mean, that's a huge statistic. I mean, you and I could never imagine that amount of people.
Yes, mind boggles, really.
Exactly, but out of that 1.3 million, 1.1 million die. They're murdered in this camp, and just under 1 million of those are Jewish.
Around 1 in 6 Jews murdered in the Holocaust died in Auschwitz. The greatest number of the camp's Jewish victims were from Hungary, accounting for 430,000 deaths, followed by 300,000 Polish Jews. At its peak in 1944, when Auschwitz-Birkenau was central to the extermination of Hungarian Jews, the camp's population was anywhere between 90 to 100,000 people. Jews from various countries, Poles, Roma, Soviet prisoners of war, and others made up the total of 1.3 million people deported to Auschwitz. Of that number, approximately 1.1 million were murdered in the camp, gassed, starved to death, or executed.
Okay, Alina, we're in front of crematorium number 3. We can see an undressing room and then the gas chamber and then the crematorium at the end. What was the process by which, this was the machinery of extermination, you could say, what was the process by which the people were selected, driven into these places and then find the gas? And could you describe for us the context of the Sonderkommando in this process, its tasks and its composition?
So in the opening scene, you were seen on the platform where the transport would arrive. People would be unloaded, everything would be calm, their luggage would be put onto the platform. Then the selection process would begin. Men would stand in one line, women in another, and then they would be pointed either right or left, but nobody knew which way was the good side. Then they would be selected to the process, which is the better side. Those who were sent for labour would be sent out into the baths, registered for labour and things like that. Those who were sent to the gas chamber, they would be sent either to here, crematoria 2, or behind us is also crematoria 4 and 5. And they would end up here, out in this field, before heading down these stairs, undressing here, and then being led onto the left-hand side into the gas chamber. Now, what was the process, you asked? I mean, what did the Sonderkommando do? The Sonderkommando were those prisoners who were forced to participate in the gassing process. So they were the ones that would help and calmly direct people into the gas chamber. Doors would be closed. Zyklon B would be dropped in the top by a member of the hygiene section of the SS. Then they would be removed, the corpses would be removed out of the gas chamber, bodies would be searched, hair would be shaved. This is all done by the Sonderkommando prisoners. They would also have teeth removed, gold teeth, that's important. And you can see ahead of us, that's where the crematorium was. They were put onto this platform, taken up to the ovens and put into the ovens. And you've got to remember, a body wouldn't completely burn, so parts of the thigh and the hip bone would still be there. So prisoners were forced to crush these into ashes, and then they would be scattered around, so either in local ponds, into the rivers, so the Wisła or Soła River, for example, or out into the fields that would also be used as fertilizer. And there's a field just further north up here, and there's, in the summer, absolutely beautiful flowers that grow there.
Was this a process that was arrived by accident, development? Were they burying the bodies first, or just how is this fairly scientific method achieved?
It's a really horrible thing that I'm going to say right now, but it was trial and error.
Yeah.
Right? This is how we got to this stage. It's not like they began this gassing process and everything was perfect and idyllic and everything went as they wanted it to. That's not how it worked. They began burying the bodies, especially the Soviets who died over the winter and things like that. The problem is that when they were buried and they started to decompose, they began poisoning the local water supply. So of course you've got to dig up the bodies and you've got to burn them. These crematoriums are working 24 hours a day, but crematoria 5 was a lot smaller, so they would burn people out on pyres. And that was the quickest and easiest way. There's also really interesting surveillance aerial footage by the Allies where you can see just outside crematoria 5 as you see these burning plumes of smoke coming up, and that's where they're burning people on those pyres right there. But apparently you can smell all the way from Krakow. That is how far, and we're talking a couple 100 kilometres from here.
So you get the wind in the right direction.
Exactly, exactly. So you could smell it, and this is the question that prisoners, when they arrived here, would say, like, what is that smell? Why can I feel this sort of sticky substance all over me? And other prisoners would point and say, you know.
Were the prisoners aware of their fate at the selection process?
No, it's a very simple answer. Everything was quiet, everything was orderly. You've got an amazing album, the Lily Jacob album, which now resides in the Yad Vashem, and you can see that whole process. The only part it doesn't show is the actual gassing process, but it shows the arrival of the Hungarian Jews. It shows you the selection process, when they walked to the gas chamber, as they're sitting out in the field, and there's a very famous part of this photograph that's been cut out, this little boy holding this little flower and just offering it up to, it's so innocent. You know, people who were going to die would be chaotic. This was so orderly. There really wasn't a selection process till they realised elderly people don't last long, so what's the point in feeding them, you know, and wasting resources on such people. The other thing was women, especially women with children. At the beginning, women were allowed to stay, those who had children. The children would be sent to the gas chamber. But then a woman who loses their child and realises they've been gassed and burnt in the crematorium, she's not going to survive long either. So it was much easier to be able to move those women and just take them straight away as a whole family, just straight into the gas chamber.
As the tides of war turned in January 1945, the Soviet Vistula-Oder offensive forced the Germans to abandon Auschwitz. By January 12th, Soviet forces crossed the Vistula River, quickly overran German defenses, capturing swathes of territory and closing in on Auschwitz. Beginning on January 17, 1945, the SS started evacuating approximately 58,000 prisoners from Auschwitz and its subcamps. Forced on brutal death marches westward, towards camps in Germany, many prisoners perished from exhaustion or starvation, or were outright executed. As the Red Army drew nearer, the Germans endeavored to leave no shred of evidence of their crimes behind. But it all came to naught as the sheer size of the camp's infrastructure and grim remnants of its operations made it impossible to fully hide the horrid truth. On January 27, 1945, the Soviets walked into Auschwitz, witnesses to a testimony of suffering told by the gaunt bodies of some 7,000 people still remaining in the camp.
Alina, we're commemorating the 80th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, 1945. What was the mood like in the camp in those days of late January of that year?
Well, the evacuation of prisoners didn't really start up until the Red Army was a certain distance outside of Krakow. Then about 56,000 prisoners are moved from the camp complexes out onto forced marches. Many of them head towards Gliwice. And many of them are forced to physically walk those hundreds of kilometres, hundreds of miles. And the conditions of these forced marches are probably the most difficult thing these prisoners are going to go through. It is cold. Right now, winter in Poland is not as bad as it was in those days. It was much colder, more snow. If you lagged behind, you'd be shot. If you tried to escape, you would be shot. You've got scenes from testimonies from people where they would say that, you know, they would walk past corpses just strewn about across the road. The SS were dismissed around about the 20th or the 21st, so we're looking at nearly 7 days before the actual liberation, before the Soviets crossed those gates. They managed to blow up crematoria 2, 3, 4 was already destroyed in October of 1944, and 5 were still operating and still not blown up, still existing till the day before liberation. When the Soviets crossed that border, crossed those gates...
And how many were left in the camp?
You have 7,000 across 3 camps. So across Monowitz, Auschwitz I, the main camp, and here in Birkenau, where we're standing today. People were skin and bones. The chaos in between the time of the SS leaving to the Soviets arriving, there were even Soviet prisoners of war firing weapons off. There were SS patrols around, but there were no guards here on site.
Well, thank you very much, Alina Nowobilska, for joining us on this programme.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
What does Auschwitz tell us? Its grim wooden blocks, the haunting gaze of the prisoners in its photo records, the vastness of its scale. It tells us that we do not learn from history, that countries count their own, of the bottomless continuous nature of man's inhumanity to man, and of the triumph of the human spirit. We should know all this, but it is no less true for all that.